field, and we were going to shoot crosswind landings. And the wind was blowing across the landing runway at about a 45-degree angle, or maybe at a 90-degree angle. I think it switched about 90 degrees across the runway. And he showed me one crosswind landing, so I thought, well, okay, and my turn to land. So went around and landed, and these landings we were just doing touch and goes. In other words, you put the wheels on the runway, added power, and took off, went around, and come to a full stop, and landed again. Well, he said, well, it was, you do the next one. So I went around, and I'd done some crosswind landings on my own before, and I didn't do it like he wanted me to do it. Like if the runway was between you and me, and the airplane was flying along like this, and the wind was from the right, which it was that day, he wanted you to just turn the airplane into the wind and fly level and descend, and when it got down near the runway, straighten it out. Well, I had a different idea that worked well for me. Instead of turning into the wind, I just put the upwind wing down and just slipped into the wind and straightened up and landed, and I made a good landing and everything was okay. Boy, he was furious. He started cussing. And he grabbed the stick, and we'd taken off again, and he'd grabbed the stick and climbed about 500 feet or 1,000 feet, it was rather, and make a left-hand turn on a crosswind, and then make a rectangular pattern and come back. Well, on that crosswind turn, he did a snap roll, a snap turn, and I didn't realize he's going to do it. And when he snapped that airplane, I mean, he snapped it hard enough to snap the wings clean off of it. And he sat in the front seat, and he made you sit up real high in the seat. And the canopy was right close to your top of your head. And of course, those times where we had glass goggles, and I had my goggles pushed up on my helmet. And when he snapped that airplane, my head banged back and forth on the canopy, and it busted my goggles, and glass fell all down in my face and in my eyes. And I really got upset. I was furious. Tell you the truth, I decided, I'll tell you what, I'm gonna show you, Rock. I'm gonna solo you. I wonder how you'd like that. He'd already soloed me, so I was gonna solo you. So I reached and pulled the canopy back just to make sure I unlocked and pull it back about 2 or 3 inches. He's sitting back of me. He didn't notice. He was still cussing. And just as I reached to unbuckle my seatbelt and pull my shoulder harness off, I was going to get out on the wing and wave goodbye and jump out, soloing. Now, I was so mad I didn't realize that I was too low to do that, but I was going to do it anyway. Just as I started to unbuckle in fact, I just released it and hadn't pulled it off, and of course you have the shoulder harnesses. You unbuckle a seatbelt, and the shoulder harnesses are hooked into the seatbelt, and you got to get rid of both of them off your shoulders and all to be able to get up out of the seat. And just as I was doing that, the tower called and says, all upperclassmen, attention, attention. You have the rest of the day off. You have a pass to for the rest of the day. Return to home base. And I just sat there a second. I didn't have my hands on the stick at all. In fact, I believe he didn't have his on it either. He thought that I'd taken back over again after he did that snap roll. And he screamed out, ain't even used the microphone, well, you dumb, didn't you hear the tower? Go back to the field. I just reached over and closed the canopy and told him on the intercom, yes, sir. And I headed back to the field and landed. It's a good thing I didn't solo him. That would have been the end of my flying right then. There you go. And finally got through all that, and that's where I graduated and was appointed a second lieutenant in the Army Air Corps and got my pilot's wings. Wow. And I was really pleased then, and the students in my class, we talk about the rock a lot, and we said, you know, that rock better not ever get overseas in our fighter outfit. He better stay in back, because if he gets up front, he's going to have a real bad accident. Because we get in a dogfight and he's in the way, I don't know if we can tell the difference between him and a German Focke-Wulf or ME-109. And anyway, from there, we went to Tallahassee, which was a replacement depot. Tallahassee, Florida was a replacement depot for sending pilots overseas. But instead, when we went there, well, we had to go for fighter training then, because we hadn't flown any fighters. And they transferred me and the pilots I was with to Marianna, Florida. And they had another airfield there, and they had P-40, Curtiss P-40 Warhawks. And that's the same airplane that Chenault flew in China and had the tiger's teeth on the nose, you know. Mm-hmm. And of course, there was no two-place airplanes. They just gave you some ground school instruction, and you got some time in the cockpit and learned how to fire up, and then next thing you know, while you were scheduled to fly, and you went out and got in the cockpit and fired up, taxied out, and took off. The first time I took off, I thought, oh brother, black smoke pouring out of the stacks on each side of the engine, and that thing detonating something fierce. I said, I know what's wrong. I just reached up and pulled a mixture back, and leaned it out, cleared right up. And I went on around and made 2 or 3 landings, then went off and flew a little while, and I don't know, I guess we got we 10 or 15 hours in it, and there at Marianna, and then we were assigned to different fighter training outfits here in Florida, and I was assigned to Sarasota. And the Sarasota Municipal Airport is there now. It's where we trained. It was Army Air Force training, and we had P-40s there. And of course there, we did all kinds of practice maneuvers, landings, and we had gunnery. And this P-40 had 4 .30 caliber machine guns, 2 in each wing, and we would shoot at a towed target. Another P-40 would tow a target behind it on a cable off the coast of Sarasota and in the Gulf of Mexico, and we'd come in. Our flights would come in. There was flights of 4, and we'd make diving passes on that and shoot at this towed target. And in those days, why those P-40s, they didn't have any kind of gun sight except just out on the fuselage, a circle and a little post in the circle, and you had to aim with that like you were shooting ducks with a shotgun. Wow. And had to compute your lead and everything to hit the target. And most of the targets were a flat screen, a cloth-covered screen, and a bar at front attached to the tow cable. And when you shot at the screen, well, each of the airplanes had different colored wax on the bullets, and when they went through, it would leave a red or green or yellow or blue on where the bullet went through the screen, and that way when they come back to the field, they dropped the target and released it, had a release on the tow plane and dropped the cable in the target, and he went out and got it in a Jeep and brought it back to operations, and the instructor counted your score, tell you how good you did. And you had to be careful of making a pass on that target. You didn't fly into it. And also that you didn't lead it too much and shoot the airplane instead of the target. But sometimes they towed a silk target, and it was a round silk towed on a black circle that looked like a bicycle wheel tire with a tire on it. And it was like a windsock, you know, at an airport. And they towed it behind it. And you shoot that, and the bullets would go through the silk. They'd count the same way. But we finally found out that if we gave it just exactly enough lead and fired where the apex of the guns in the wings crossed. You see, in a fighter plane, guns in the wings, they're not aimed straight ahead. They're aimed like this, and out there at I forget how many yards while they crossed. And if you fired where they crossed, you get the most shots in the target. But we also found if we gave it just a little bit extra lead, we could blow that ring all to pieces, and the target would fall down in the water. That didn't make us very popular with the instructors. They would be furious when they want to know who shot it off. Of course, no one would say. And the guy towing the airplane, towing the target, was a student. And unfortunately, I didn't want that towing job. And I never had it. But one of the guys. Students shot at the target, and one of the students I knew real well was flying the tow plane, and some way or another, well, I forget, he made a turn or something, and the cable wrapped around the wing of the airplane and tore one aileron up and everything else. But he managed to come back in, and he rolled over and got it loose and managed to come back in and drop it. But it had busted the windshield and everything else, and he was all cut up. Because it's glass in those days, you know, the windshield was. But then from there, we went to back to Tallahassee, and we was signed to go overseas. We went to an Army Air Base near Newark, New Jersey, and then we went to New York and got on we didn't fly over. We got on a ocean liner. I forget. I think it was a Mauritania. Sort of like it was the Queen Mary was doing it too. We didn't get on. We weren't on the Queen Mary. And when we got out to sea for the first day, it was breakfast and went down to the mess and I couldn't believe it because we weren't used to tablecloths on the table and everything, you know, and the next thing you know, one from behind you said, "May I serve you, sir?" and handed you a menu. And he was English waiter on that ship when it was running civilian. And so you ordered from the menu, and I was real surprised because I've eaten a lot of fish, but I never saw fish for breakfast. They had fish on the breakfast menu. I didn't want fish anyway, and it was very deluxe accommodations because the officers had the upper decks where the first class passengers were. But I found out how the enlisted people rode. They rode in the holes in the lower decks, and man, I mean, that was really, really crowded. And anyway, we got on overseas, and there we went to another fighter replacement depot where all the fighter pilots from the States come in, and they assigned them to different fighter outfits in England and Europe. And we were at that place where we were living in a corrugated galvanized iron Nissen hut. And I'm sure you know what a Nissen hut is. It was a round building like that, and had down each side they had rows of just single deck cots and an aisle down the middle, and at the end of the aisle, there was a little pot-bellied iron stove, and that was supposed to be for the heat. And of course, we were there in September, I think it was, and so although it was cold, they didn't ration out any coal or anything to build a fire in that stove with. And one day, I come back to the place, and in the afternoon, after lunch, and boy, I'm telling you, I felt so cold. And so some of the guys there asked me what was wrong. Well, the night before, I'd really had chills and fever, and I put on, I don't know why, but they issued us bomber-style jackets and boots with fleece-lined boots and fleece-lined leather jackets and all. And boy, I put on my leather jacket, my gloves, my boots, and got in my bunk and covered up with my blankets. And I'm still shaking and chattering. And 1 minute, and the next minute, I'm trying to get that jacket off because I'm sweating. And the next morning, why, the guy said, "Well, you better go on sick call." I don't want to go on sick call. "Yeah, you go on sick call." So I said, "Okay." So I went over to the hospital and reported in for sick call, and there was this little second lieutenant doctor sitting at a desk there, and he walked up and says, "Well, what's wrong with you?" I said, "I don't know. I've got chills and fever." And he took my temperature and looked at me, and there was a sergeant sitting beside him making notes, and he said, "Okay," and he gave me some aspirin, and one of the typical, take 2 aspirin and see me later. As I turned away, he said to this sergeant, "Ain't anything wrong with him. He's just got combat colic." Boy, he don't know how close it come to me turning around and just knocking him out of that chair. But I just gritted my teeth, and I felt so bad, I just walked on out. And I went back, because there again, if I'd have gotten in a fight, I'd have been in trouble. Went back to the barracks, and boy, I was feeling cold again, and some of the guys went out and scrounged up a few lumps of hard coal and a few sticks of splintered lumber or something somewhere, and come back and build a little fire in that stove. And I was standing there warming my hands by it, and there wasn't much heat from it. And all of a sudden, I realized I had to sit down. And I started backing up. My bunk was right close to the stove, and I started backing up to my bunk to sit down on the end of my bunk. And instead of backing up to my bunk, I backed up between my bunk and another one. And I just kept on backing up, and boy, the next thing I knew, I felt it, but my head just cracked into that curved metal wall behind me, and I fell on down to the floor. And next thing I knew, there was one guy picking me up by the arms, and another couple of guys had my feet, and they laid me on the bunk. And I come back to, and they were saying, "Call the ambulance, call it." I said, wait a minute, don't call any ambulance," because we had already been assigned to our fighter groups. And in my bunch that had gone all the way through all of this flight training and pre-aviation cadet and all, there was still 10 of us that went through it together. And this one, when they assigned us to the flight group a few days before I got sick, a day or two before I got sick, we called us into a meeting hall, and it had like a big auditorium and a stage, and up on the stage, they would announce, "Well, this fighter group with the 9th Air Force need 5 pilots," and so if 5 guys knew each other, they'd all raise their hand, and they'd say, "Okay, you 5, come up here," and they'd come up and get their names, and they'd be assigned to that outfit. And the next thing you know, they said, "Well, the 4th fighter group needs 10 pilots." And they looked out there, they didn't think there were going to be 10 pilots going to raise their hand all at one time. And boy, all 10 of us shot our hands up, and we went up there and put our names down, and they assigned us to the 4th fighter group. We didn't realize at the time, but that was a prestigious fighter group, because the 4th fighter group formerly was the Eagle Squadron in the Royal Air Force. And the Eagle Squadron was made up of pilots that were U.S. pilots, but before the U.S. got into the war, they went to Canada and joined the Royal Air Force and went over, and they were flying Spitfires with the Royal Air Force. We didn't realize that at the time. We just wanted some outfit that had need for 10 pilots. We could all go together. So that's the reason I didn't want them to call the ambulance. But they called the ambulance anyway, and next thing I knew, man, there was 2 corpsmen in that Neeson hut and loading me on a stretcher and putting me in an ambulance, hauling me to the hospital. I was on that base, they had a big hospital. And I got in the hospital, and the doctors checked me out there, and they decided that I had mono and hepatitis. mononucleosis and hepatitis.
Holy cow.
And of course, the only thing they knew they had access to and knew at those times was sulfa, and also, what was it they gave you by a syringe? Was that sulfa?
No, penicillin.
Penicillin, yeah, sulfa and penicillin. And so you got shots in the hip
Every 2 hours.
every 2 hours, all night and all day, with that needle. And there was this hospital wing that I was in had, of course, beds down each side, and it was real long. It must have been 50 feet or more long, and there must have been, I don't know, 75 or 80 patients in there. And one night I woke up again, and I was getting real cold, and so it was real quiet. It was about 2:30 in the morning. There wasn't anybody around, and so I was going to hunt a stove, and I went and got out of my bunk and walked down past the nurse's station. Of course, there wasn't anybody in there, and went on out in the hall and walked down the hall. Finally found a kitchen, and there was a blazing coal stove in there, fired up for cooking breakfast. There wasn't anybody in there. And I just warmed up my hands on that stove and that old flat top, and it felt so good. And looked at my fingernails, and they were blue. I just warmed up my hands, went on back to my bunk and got in my bunk, and I stopped being cold, and I was okay.
How long were you sick about?
I don't know.
10 weeks.
Was that how long it was? I was in there 10 weeks. And of course, they gave me all kinds of penicillin and medicine and everything else they could. And finally, I got over it okay. And but so then they sent me from there to rehabilitation center instead of directly to the 4th Fighter Group. I was still assigned to 4th Fighter Group. I had orders to send me to the 4th Fighter Group. And at the rehabilitation center, this is for guys that had been in combat, and they were coming back from France for rehab. And these guys would ask me, what unit were you in and so forth, and I had to tell them, I haven't been in combat yet. I'm a fighter pilot. I'm assigned to the 4th Fighter Group. And they'd say, oh. Well, at that place, they had Red Cross people, and one of the Red Cross women asked me, well, what would you like to do? And and when the sun, this was at a big English, not a castle, but a mansion. It was out in the country, and there wasn't any other places around. You could look across the fields for long ways, and late in the evening, about right after sundown, why, I'd never seen a pheasant, and these pheasant would flush and fly up into hedgerows and cackle and then land for the night. And they do something, quail do the same thing, and they land instead of walking to it. Why they do that so that foxes and other cats and animals wouldn't be able to trail them to where they were roosting for the night. I told her I want to go hunting. She said, you do? I said, yeah, you got a gun you can get me? She says, I don't know, I believe I know somebody that's got a gun. So she knew some of the Englishmen in that area. Of course, you couldn't see anybody else's where they lived, house or mansion or anything. But anyway, she come back with a 12 gauge double barrel, big curled hammers, but and also she had about 6 or 8 shells for it, and I think they were number 6s. So the next day, I went out, and when you ate meals, in between meals, you didn't have anything to do. And next morning after breakfast, I took the gun and I went off down the road, and there wasn't anybody around. I walked back through some fields and was walking along a hedgerow, and all of a sudden this pheasant jumped up and cackle, 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 and he was flopping along above and I just looked at him. I didn't even think to shoot at him. Went on back, and then that afternoon, or when I went back, was one of those infantrymen saw me, and he said, "Where'd you go with that shotgun?" I said, "I went hunting." "Hunting? You mean they let you?" I said, "Sure. They told me I could go hunting." And he says, "Can I go with you?" I said, "Well, I'm going tomorrow morning. You want to go?" I said, he said, "Yes." I said, "You got a gun?" He said, "Well, I got my carbine." He had a 30-30 semi-auto carbine, you know. And I said, "Well, bring it. We'll see what we can find." So we went out and looking along the same area, and these fields were had been planted in some kind of grain, and the stalks had been cut off about 6 inches above the ground, and looked out, and we were walking along, looked out in the middle of the field.
I'm trying to lighten a little bit.
There was a big English hare sitting out in the middle of the field, and he was about 35 yards or so from us.
No, I don't want so much light on him. No. Just. There we go. I'm sorry, go ahead.
And I said, "Do you?" I said, he was standing right close to me. I said, "Do you see that rabbit out there?" He said, "No, where?" And I wondered, well, how in the heck were you in the infantry? 'Cause that thing's sitting up there, you know, like that, you know, like a big jackrabbit out in Texas. Yeah. and I said, "He's right out there." And I pointed to him, and as I pointed to him while the hare was looking at us, and so I said, "Shoot him, shoot him." And about that time, while the hare looked at us, and he started hopping off, I said, "Well, why don't you shoot him?" And so about that time, I thought, well, I'll shoot him. Well, I cut down on him with that shotgun and one barrel, and I hit him, and the fur just flew, but it didn't even faze him. He went on a little further, and I shot him again. The fur flew again, didn't faze him, and he run to the hedgerow and went in a hole in the ground, a burrow, rabbit burrow. And I looked at this guy and said, "Why didn't you shoot him?" He said, "I didn't even think to." And anyway, I don't know, I stayed there a week or 10 days or 2 weeks. I don't know how long I stayed there, but then I finally went on to the 4th Fighter Group. Well, all the other 9 guys had been there this whole time I was in the hospital and in that rehab center, and they were assigned to squadrons and so forth. And I got, there was 3 squadrons in the group. There was a 334th, 335th, and a 336. And when I got there, the 336 needed a pilot, and they put me in 336. And when we first got to England, before we went to that replacement, or while we were in that replacement depot, they sent us to another air base to check out in P-51s. And there again, it was the first time in a P-51, and it was a lot different from a P-40. But these were the old A model P-51s, and they had the folding canopy that you unlocked on the side, and it folded back, and instead of sliding back, and little square windows on the side. And checked out in the P-51, and I got about 5 hours in that, and then went to the 4th Fighter Group and was assigned an airplane, and you got to fly that about 5 hours, and now you're ready to go. And this was in fall of '44, and of course by the time I got to through all of this and to the 4th Fighter Group, it was the 22nd of December. Wow. And my first mission was on the 1st of January of '45. And I was, of course, the squadrons flew in flights of 4, and there was a flight leader, a wingman, an element leader, and a wingman. And the newest pilot flew with the flight leader, his wingman. And we got over Germany and to escort bombers but half of the outfit was allowed to break away if we got in a dogfight and fight with the German fighters. And we got involved with a number of German Messerschmitt Me-109s, and boy, it was round and round, and man, they were shooting those airplanes, those 109s down. They were crashing into